we're very lucky to have Dina and Nia here, and we're going to talk a lot about risk and the investment side. And as I think some of you heard, I had a long conversation about the geopolitics earlier with General Petraeus. And so we're largely going to leave that behind. But just to throw one question to Dina at the very front, given your history in the White House on this, on the Middle East, I mean, how much do you think that has affected what's happening with investors now?
Well, first, thank you for having us today, John. It's lovely to be with you. You know, I heard Ambassador Dennis Ross talking about the situation in the region recently, and he described a tension between two forces, an axis of resilience and an axis of resistance. And I thought that that was a really smart way to frame the situation. You have an axis of resilience today with a group of leaders who are talking about visions moving forward for the future of the region, a population under the age of 35, 80% of the GCC countries, and an enormous amount of capital to spend in diversifying away from natural resources into artificial intelligence, green tech, biotech, et cetera. And also a little bit of hope in that it was only a few years ago that there were 4 countries that made peace with Israel in the Abraham Accords. And one of the things that I think is not as talked about today is the fact that those accords really brought those countries closely together. And not one of those countries has left the normalization agreements that they made, even after October 7th. And I think that's really important. I also think it's a function of the ties that now are binding them with trade, economic development, and diplomatic and security relationships. So the other side of the aisle, if you will, the axis of resistance is Iran and the proxies that it's funding and the terrorism that it's fueling all around the region. And I think the big question is what's going to happen in that tension. And I think investors are looking at that today. They want to be hopeful that resilience wins, but I think there's a big question mark.
It's interesting, isn't it? I'll bring Nia in on this. You have all these things happening in the world. You talked about the Middle East, but you also have, even today, you have China announcing it's going to retaliate against America about tariffs. And people like me who spent their whole lives warning people like you, who strangely got richer all the time, that eventually kind of geopolitics would matter. Geopolitics seems to be everywhere at the moment, especially the idea of US versus China. But from an investor's point of view, investors seem to be just keep going. How do you explain that?
Yeah, well, let me step back. First of all, great to be here, and also meaningful for me personally to be here today. If I'll just step back for a second, because I think you're right, geopolitics is one of those things that is changing, but it's one of the things that are changing. And as investors, and as humans, we have this tendency to look at what we've just experienced and just extrapolate that forward. Just say, you know, what we just knew is the normal, and we can just extrapolate that forward, and that's the thing that's going to keep happening. When you look at the last, let's call it 15 years, the stars have aligned for investors. I mean, it's been a tremendous period for investors. If you kind of go back all the way from post-financial crisis, asset prices are low, tons of liquidity, then met with zero interest rates, zero inflation, and like you're saying, geopolitical, secular conditions are also disinflationary. In just a very long run, that we have a blip in COVID, we get a hit, but then again, a lot of liquidity, we get flooded again, and fiscal and monetary jubilee, and it's pretty incredible. You look at that 15-year period, and if you take US equities as an example, US equities in that time period, returns 2-3x compared to any other decade for investors. And now we're sitting here, and you have to ask yourself, going back to your question, are things changing, or are they the same? What should we prepare for going forward? And a lot of people have a lot of views. That's what investors do. They have differentiated views. But if you just take stock of what's happening right now, so right now asset prices are a lot higher, and interest rates are higher in a way that there's a hurdle rate for investors to kind of make decisions. The backdrop of geopolitics, like you're saying, has changed. It went from being disinflationary to much more inflationary. Tariffs. What happens if Trump gets elected? What you just mentioned about investments in green energy, investments in AI. You look forward, and yes, geopolitics is one of the things that have changed, but a lot looks very, very different going forward. And my advice to investors here is don't use the playbook for the last 10, 15 years for the next 10, 15 years.
But that's the interesting thing is that over the last, I'm bringing Dina on this, in the world that has happened over the last few years, you would have thought that investors would have said, help, there is such a thing as inflation. Help, there is, geopolitics is there. You've got things which possibly even when you were in the White House, you didn't imagine happening, and yet still they push. What do you think, Dina?
Well, I think it's interesting because obviously there's a U.S. election coming up, and there's going to be, in some ways, a lot of change, possibly or not. And I think this morning, one of the interesting things that happened when the Biden administration announced the new tariff regime is that it's just putting kind of another affirmation on what will be tension between the U.S. and China. So I think as much as things are changing, there's a few things that I think you can count on probably being the same right now. In particular, they may have different approaches, but the same sense. It's very politically potent right now for both sides to talk about this issue. I thought it was interesting that the Biden administration didn't do the broad sweeping tariff approach that Trump is proposing. They really focused $18 billion of imported goods in the sectors that are most governed by the national security principles, whether it's AI, the semiconductor, steel, aluminum. And so I think the headline is, this is here to stay, and this is something that I actually see our investors and clients starting to recognize, that the US-China tension is going to remain, and they're going to have to start investing with that lens.
You just see the world breaking up into regional economies. You end up with an America's economy, you end up with a European one and an Asian one, a sort of Asia ex-China and Asia including China.
What's been interesting over the last 4 years, and certainly after Putin attacked Ukraine, is there's strength, at least in the international organizations. They're, closing ranks in terms of allies with NATO and some of the international organizations. Economically, Nir made a really good point. We were getting more intertwined.
Yes.
And yet today, I think some of the military conflicts really do, put some people on different sides. Russia, China, and I think that's yet to play out for investors.
Now, when you talked about a new normal, and you sort of implied investors are out there, they still haven't moved enough to that idea that risk has fundamentally changed. What is the classic mistake that investors are making? In terms of asset classes or whatever, what is the thing when you sit down with an investor opposite, you may have some here, what is the classic sort of error they're making? Obviously, all your investors are brilliant, but allowing for that.
Correct, but so it kind of builds on what Dina said. I think humility and knowing that you're most likely going to be wrong about these big things, because I agree with everything Dina said. I mean, the world, we were globalizing. People optimize for supply chain. How can I cut 1% off of the? Now people are talking about resiliency. Now
Yes.
people talk about onshoring. People talk about, hey, how could I defend myself against? And we have this tendency to look at things like, by the way, AI could be a force in the other direction where scale matters and can actually bring people together. We tend to look at these things and think that we have a clue about how they're going to play out. And if any of you or any of us look back 10 years and say, how close were we? We were pretty far.
Yeah.
And look at the decade before that, how close were we? We were pretty far. So the biggest mistake I think that investors make is they develop overconfidence. And our advice to our investors is, one, stare at your portfolio hard and make sure you understand it well. And what I mean by that is, if you just don't assume the next decade is going to be like the last one, what environments is your portfolio going to perform well in? And what is it not going to perform well in? And then stress test it. Literally say, hey, what if policy is going to stay tighter? What if inflation is going to remain higher? What if U.S. outperformance will not persist? What will happen with my portfolio? And then measure that against your goals, because every investor has specific goals in their portfolios. And close those gaps by doing one of three things, basically. Either shift your allocations, shift within your allocations, so you can stay allocated to equities in the same way, but choose the equities that perform more in the ways that you want relative to your goals, relative to how you structure your portfolios, and or create return streams that specifically address the problems that you are worried about. So you can hedge tail risk, you can do other things. That's what we do at Bridgewater. I mean, we spend a lot of time, including with clients here, talking to them about their portfolio, stress testing it, and then making sure that we create solutions at the total portfolio level to kind of
There's one really obvious thing that over all that period, one reason why people have done very well is if you simply bought 6 American tech stocks, and under your, and just to push you on that, under your thing that the new normal won't be the same, that would imply, to me at least, that maybe those US tech stocks won't do as well over the next decade as they have over the past period.
Your big point, I could not agree with more.
Yeah.
This is what I meant in the beginning. The previous decade was like a straight flush for investors. You dropped, not just in the US, you dropped the dollar basically almost anywhere and you do well. And it could be US tech stocks, it could be other things. I agree that you should be open to a much wider range of outcomes and assume that you're going to be wrong. Even Bridgewater, we have 400 people spending day in and day out mapping cause-effect linkages in the world, and we still get 40% of our calls wrong.
Yeah.
So you have to acknowledge the fact that you're going to be wrong a lot and just make sure you're building a resilient portfolio, which you really didn't quite need in the previous decade, but you will need in the next decade.
Dina, do you agree with that? That it's spreading the next, there has been an easy option for the past period, that now it's going to get more difficult?
I think it depends on the investor, to be honest. At BDT and MSD Partners, we're really focused on a network of families and founders who think very long term. And really, I think the secret sauce is long-term aligned capital. And that presents opportunities. I'll give you an example. As much as the 6 or 7 big tech stocks and AI and the arms race and the learning applied models, our clients are very focused on what we call secondary opportunities. The opportunities that are going to build the platforms, the infrastructures, so that those new sectors can actually take off. What does that require? Long-term patient capital, unique partnership, trusted partnership, and advice. And I think that we're seeing, whether it's the servers or semiconductors, all sort of the nuts and bolts, if you will. You can't have AI without it, but you need a certain kind of capital and certain kind of partners that will stick with you as you're building that.
We're going to come back to kind of long-term view, and particularly this region in a second, but just the other big thing that has happened, very obviously, is that during this period, the amount of non-public companies that do, so much of capitalism, our job at Bloomberg, I rather pompously say, is to chronicle capitalism, but so much capitalism is now taking place in the private markets. It's outside the range of the various indexes we follow. And I wonder how both of you try and deal with that. Nia, do you want to go first?
You go first.
I mean, I think that is, taken together with your point about the US, that is one of the questions that investors have to stare at. In this world where liquidity is not infinite, where there is a hurdle rate and investments have to justify themselves, I do think that staring at the allocations to non-liquids, staring at the allocation geographically to the US, are one of those things that could create outsized exposures and non-resilient portfolios. So I definitely agree. It depends on each investor, their goals, and where they currently stand. But it would definitely be one of those things that we would recommend people revisiting.
But do you think this is part of is this a permanent shift where we look forward? The past century, we've been used, when you measure capitalism, to look at public companies that everyone can invest in. Over the next period, it's actually going to be private capitalism that drives things.
I don't think anything is a permanent shift. I think history repeats itself over and over and over again. No, in that sense, I think the same mechanics, the same physics will work here going into the future again.
What about you, Dina? You've seen both sides, you could argue.
I've lived both sides,
Yes.
you could argue. Actually, I was talking to our CEO, Greg Lemkow, this morning about how to best articulate what this question of private versus public. And I think of it as the 3 Ps: private credit, private capital, and private industries. Private credit, we all know this is the age of private credit. It's obvious why. The large financial institutions have high cost of capital, regulatory burdens, so the financing markets have really tightened. And so I think that that's going to continue. And also, again, back to kind of the families and founders that we work with, it's also a great income-producing mechanism. The second, private capital. Frankly, it's also less burdensome in many ways, and we've really focused on,
Yes.
co-investment opportunities. And then finally, private industry. And what I mean by that is the more public-facing, the more thorny an industry is that's going to require CFIUS approval or regulation, I think people are shying away from. I think it's just, again, you look at what happened this morning, I think there's just going to be higher regulatory burdens to get investments in those industries. And so I think you're going to see more what I call private industries that just don't require that kind of scrutiny.
Sort of going back to what I said at the beginning is that maybe 10, 20 years ago, you could have had a company that just assumed the world was going to become more global, more similar, and the governments, both of us and all of us in different ways would have met people who said, Washington doesn't matter, this is all about how wonderful and free and unfettered my company is. Now, two ways. Firstly, Washington, or for that matter, Downing Street or the Elysee, can come and interrupt your business, but also it can give you a lot of money to go and do something, so that knowing about government has become more important. Do you think that's fair? I'm playing to your strengths, Dina. It's your CV.
Yeah, well, I think certainly investors are watching what governments around the world are doing. I heard Ken Griffin when he was on this stage earlier this week, and he was talking about the enormous deficit that we're facing, and frankly, it doesn't look like Washington is going to stop that spending anytime soon. I think that you look at the subcommittee on China that Chairman Gallagher put out a bunch of new policies, even potentially a reverse CFIUS. So even if you don't want to deal with government, you're likely to have to if you're investing in certain sectors for sure. And I think whether or not it's true, I do think investors feel it. They feel a heavy regulatory burden and frankly are increasingly really worried about the size of the deficit, but that's also not politically popular. So you're not seeing Republicans or Democrats in the US talking about what it really means to attack that deficit and debt.
The experience from Britain, at least, is that people don't worry about these things until suddenly you have a Liz Truss moment, and then it becomes the most important thing. Sorry.
No, I would agree. I mean, I think governments matter more, period. On both sides, you kind of alluded to it in your question. We've learned things about fiscal easing post-COVID that are, I think these are lessons that are going to be carried forward. These are real things. And when we talk about tariffs or regulation, even what happens, who's going to nominate the next Fed chair if Trump wins the election, these are all things that make governments play a bigger and bigger role. It could be positive, it could be negative. It depends also on the eyes of who's looking at it. But I agree that trend is definitely picking up.
About inflation, we mentioned inflation at the beginning, and there'll be many people here who spend every second looking at dot plots and so on. Are you still scared by inflation?
Scared?
Yeah.
We're never scared by inflation, meaning I think this is normal. It just depends on where you were. But the idea that, yes, if you flood with liquidity and you spur up demand, especially if there's also a problem on the supply side, prices will change. That's the physics of how these things work. For a while, we kind of forgot it. So no, not afraid, and we think there's a way to go. We think this reality is here to stay. We started this year with 6 easings kind of priced in. Everybody thought, no, we're going back to that world, and now we've seen the market correct, and we think that's going to be the dance. That's going to be the dance that the Fed and all of us are going to have to dance in the U.S. And by the way, when you look at that, also look at the divergences. We tend to talk a lot about the U.S., but the picture you see in Europe and other places is vastly different. It doesn't make sense to us, to Bridgewater. It didn't make sense there will be 6 easings. Still probably wouldn't make sense to us there will be any easings this year. But you look at Europe, you look at what Switzerland just did, different picture, and you see divergences in the world that are also interesting for investors who are looking for opportunities about how to deploy their capital.
Just quickly on that, do you, when you look at Europe, I mean, again, having just come from seeing Macron on Monday, his whole pitch is that Europe is sclerotic. It is not, it needs to reform itself dramatically. And I looked at the numbers, even France, which has done quite well since he became president, has grown half as fast as America. Is there any, do you see any sign in your world that is changing from the past decade to the next? Do you see any sign of a kind of rebirth in Europe?
So I would separate that to secular and cyclical
Yeah.
forces. Secular, I do think there's a lot of things that fundamentally need to be reformed in Europe. That's been talked about in Asia. But cyclically, I do think they are in a better spot. I mean, if the U.S., I believe, in order to slow inflation, will need actual restrictive policy. Like the reality is that to bring inflation down, you have to slow the economy.
Yes.
It's just the way it works. In Europe, they're past that point. They're much more ready at this point to ease.
Slowing the economy, I think we can agree Europeans are brilliant at it.
Yeah, they're very good. It's a talent.
It's something they can do without.
But at this point, they can actually stimulate. They are past that hump, and so in that sense, cyclically, there's room for optimism in Europe.
Dina, what about you? Just two things, just on Europe, but then maybe we could come on to the Middle East as well.
Well, I just want to follow up on one thing Nir said. I completely agree with his view of monetary and fiscal policy, and the levers have almost all been used, and kind of we are where we are for the foreseeable future. I think it's interesting that if you look at any of the polls, you guys just recently did a bunch of polls, it's the #1 issue on voters' minds. And so I think that while it's talked about a lot, again, from what the perspective of the Federal Reserve, I actually think it's going to be the deciding issue in the U.S. election. And I think that people feel it in a way that is stronger than it has been felt in the cost of goods, and yet the decreasing in wages. And so I think that that's going to be the big issue to watch in terms of economic policy. People think it's going to be national security or social issues. I think inflation is #1.
You would agree, presumably.
I mean, especially. I think economy is always a big, but I agree with everything Dina said, but especially because it leads to also the type of stuff that changes politics. So we talk about social inequality. Wealth is also incredible. I mean, one of the things that is leading to inflation is, gold, Bitcoin. There's a lot of stuff that creates wealth that is certainly blooming in this environment of ample liquidity. So it's a subset of the population feels the inflation when they're going to the gas station, and a part of it feels incredibly wealthy. And so it's both what Dina's saying and the fact that it's kind of tearing society apart from a social inequality standpoint.
It is, and you were talking about what's happened in the last 10, 15 years and why that wealth gap has grown so much. I mean, people who had assets. Well, you didn't have to be that smart. I mean, Bridgewater is, of course, uniquely smart. But if you had assets, your wealth and income rose, and if you didn't, you got really squeezed. And I think that's where you see the tension in that income inequality.
Can I come on to one last bit very quickly, which is this region? It's obviously, as you can see, this is a massive source of capital for financial firms to redeploy. In terms of a target for investment, how do you see that? Maybe Dina, go first, and then.
I'm bullish. I'm bullish because I've, over the last several years, worked on these issues, been in the region. I see the genuineness of the desire to move forward on the social, economic, and political reforms, although imperfectly, and certainly with some steps taken back. And frankly, it's in the U.S. national security interest that those reforms are completed, and for our allies as well. And so I think it's like a genie out of a bottle. I think once you get moving in that direction, it's hard to go back. And I actually think that it is very likely that, and we know this, that the Saudis and Israelis were very close to normalization. And in some ways, there's a saying, don't waste a good crisis, and this horrific tragedy and crisis could actually be the final straw in between those two, axis of resilience and axis of resistance. And this crisis hopefully will lead to more countries joining the Abraham Accords and a path to peace and prosperity.
What about you, Nir? When you look at this region as a target for investment at the moment, are you?
I always say that incredible people, shared values, audacious goals lead to unbelievable outcomes. I'm from the Middle East, from a different part of the Middle East, and I'm in awe. I'm truly in awe of what's been happening in this region. And of course, I think everybody's watching and seeing the innovation, the ability to build incredible things, and capital will soon follow, because that's what capital does.
Do you see the ability to build incredible companies?
Absolutely.
And in terms of particular, I mean, obviously energy is, outside energy, do you see particular industries that you think will take off here?
Yeah, I mean, you already see the participation, again, of the region in setting themselves up for the next tech wave. You see massive investments. It's a lot of the conversation we're having here today. That's taking the energy foundation and building on top of it and innovating. So I certainly see a bigger and bigger participation in the world economy in that way.
What about you, Dina? One last thing. Do you see?
You know, very much agree with Nir. Incredible human talent, enormous amount of capital that is very focused, I think, on the right sectors. But you know, entrepreneurs, I meet them all the time here and throughout the region, and they're really innovating and creating, you know, a very interesting new economic, you know, tracks. And I think, frankly, it's also interesting when you see how many women entrepreneurs throughout the region, an increase in women participating in the economy, but actually starting their own businesses. And so I think those positive forces are continuing to make investors see that it is an investable region for sure.
Well, we began with the pessimism of geopolitics, and we've ended up with a ray of light at the end. Thank you both very much for talking through.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nir. Thank you, Dina.